President Cyril Ramaphosa yesterday held discussions with leaders of neighboring states as part of a coordinated response to contain the spread of the pandemic. Ramaphosa, as African Union chairperson, has been leading continental exchanges during the COVID-19 crisis. To discuss the significance of regional coordination, I'm joined via Skype by Sia Beniza, who is the executive director at PESA, or PESA, a political economy think tank. Thank you so much for joining me, Sia. I really appreciate it. Now, the importance of having a consolidated policy framework in the battle against the pandemic, how important is it?
Sure. Look, it's very important, obviously, given the fact that the virus is quite contagious. And as the president said, it doesn't necessarily respect any borders or nationality boundaries, etc. I think in addition to that, though, we do need to coordinate, because any kind of problem that, might break out in countries like Lesotho or Eswatini, who pretty much are located within South African borders, and even our neighboring countries, will definitely have spillovers into South Africa. And so we cannot necessarily, as a region, look at this thing from just a national perspective of saying, as long as we can contain the spread, as long as we can deal with the virus, we're fine, because the neighboring countries are also part of that ecosystem that we sort of codepending on in the region.
So what will the solution then be in terms of reopening those borders, specifically with the neighboring countries and the ones that are situated within South Africa?
Sure. So what's happened now is currently at the SADC level, they've convened a SADC cell for transport and trade facilitation, which includes experts in logistics, travel, security, and trade generally, in order to facilitate harmonization of border control policies amongst member countries. I think that's a critical step in order to make sure that, one jurisdiction, one country perhaps in the region could have a lot of progress and be at a stage where they're ready to relax or reopen their economy, but that needs to be done in a way that doesn't compromise neighboring countries in the region in terms of their efforts to deal with the pandemic. And so at the one level, there is the cell in order to coordinate trade, facilitation, and transport. Then there are other coordination efforts happening in terms of the regional response. The president and other neighboring presidents have put together an envoy of about 5 people who will then go out to try and mobilize additional resources as part of the response effort. I think currently they've been able to mobilize 36 million for the response, 25 million for the response effort, and around 36 million for the Africa Center for Disease Control in order to continue with some of its work in areas such as testing as well as vaccination development.
Now, why is it important for the sharing of resources and skills amongst these member states?
Sure. Well, the first part is that nobody really has experienced this. Nobody was expecting this. And really what you want to do with the sharing of information and how countries are treating this is to be able to share some of the best practice, or even establish what is the best practice quite early on in the game. As we've seen, the response of countries in terms of how they're dealing with the virus is critical, and time is really a critical factor. So any moment lost is a moment lost in terms of the fight for the pandemic. So the sharing of information allows that in terms of information to be the best practice to be known throughout the region, but also countries that have been able to experiment in other areas. So, for example, Madagascar quite recently, I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago, came up with COVID organics, which is supposedly has been able to help certain people recover in the country. And that sharing of information then allows the testing to happen simultaneously in terms of whether this will actually work as a vaccine, and also for other countries in the region to benefit from benefits that are working in other countries that they haven't perhaps tried out. I think that is the critical part of the sharing of information, but also the coordinated effort at a regional level.
Now, South Africa has been looked at as the economic hub, at least for the SADC region. What's South Africa's responsibility in terms of helping the other countries nearby, which are all within the SADC region?
Sure. So as I mentioned, on the one hand, the president has put together, presidents generally, including neighboring presidents, have put together this envoy which will try and mobilize funds effectively to help countries to deal with the crisis, but also to get equipment such as personal protective equipment, etc. On the other hand, South Africa is also kind of charting the way in terms of policy responses to this. If you notice, some of the decision making that's been happening in terms of the lockdown has been pretty much mirrored by a lot of the neighboring countries. So South Africa is also playing that kind of role in terms of how to respond to this crisis from a policy perspective. And then lastly is South Africa trying to coordinate the public procurement effort across countries in order to ensure that smaller countries, for example, such as Lesotho or Eswatini, who may have, relatively smaller needs in terms of the procurement of personal protective equipment, won't be disadvantaged by bigger countries who have bigger monies to put towards buying of personal protective equipment. So consolidating the public procurement of those and other medicines is quite critical. So I think it's those three areas: mobilization of resources and the policy response, but also trying to coordinate the public procurement of necessary or essential personal protective equipment as well as medication and the like.
I'm looking at our AU chair, who's also the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa. How important and what is his role in all of this, and how important is it that he continues doing the work that he does specifically for the SADC region?
Sure. I think it's quite critical, both not just from the areas that I've discussed in terms of policy and coordinating at a regional level. It's also quite important in order to chart our way out of this crisis. So, the numbers that have come out so far are quite concerning. The expectation is that global growth is going to decline from a projected 3% growth to a 3.4% cut in growth. Similarly, the SADC region is also facing a similar cut at around 3.5% of GDP. And so we really need to start thinking of how do we come out of this and also continue with some of the efforts in terms of regional integration that were taking place. Last year, we concluded or came into force of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We were ready to start trading under that arrangement from June this year, but that has already been put into jeopardy as a result of the lockdown response to the pandemic. And so the president being, quite vocal and trying to get countries to now think of what a post-COVID world will look like is very critical in part of the recovery process. I think apart from the public health response, which is very important, and the coordination efforts are definitely having a benefit there, there's also a very huge benefit in terms of thinking about how do we then resume economic activity and what does the sort of post-COVID world look like. And it's critical that African countries continue on their process of regional integration, especially given that the pandemic is likely to drive a lot of countries back into sort of national ideologies and isolationism, which we've already seen, of course, quite before the COVID-19 pandemic, which is actually going to get worse moving forward.
Are there any other African countries that South Africa and the SADC countries should be looking at in terms of handling and dealing with COVID-19? I know you mentioned Madagascar's COVID organics, and there was, I think, a story a few weeks ago about Senegal or Sierra Leone with rapid testing kits being created, etc. Are there any other countries in Africa that stick out in terms of dealing with COVID-19?
Sure. And you've definitely mentioned the top two in my view, because currently at the level of the pandemic we're dealing with now is the challenge of transitioning or mass testing firstly, and then transitioning or finding a way to treat those people who are exposed to COVID-19. And so, yes, although there's been this innovation and has been research-driven from Madagascar in terms of COVID organics, there are still some challenges in terms of further testing that's needed in order to verify whether or not it can be considered as a vaccine. And obviously, the current testing that we've seen is, globally, there have been problems about accuracy of tests. There have been problems about the long time that it takes to actually conclude a test, somewhere between 40 minutes to an hour. And so the rapid testing that's been taking place in terms of innovations from Sierra Leone is definitely going to put African countries at the forefront of trying to deal with this, because at this stage, all that countries really need to focus on is testing. Fortunately, though, the African region has got the lowest numbers globally, but a large part of that is mainly because we haven't done as much testing. So far in the SADC region, South Africa is leading in terms of testing, but we've only tested around 1.5 million people in terms of our population of 60 million. Other countries, I think the max is around 3,000, 4,000 testing, and so really we need to be learning on how to mass produce the test kits, but also implement mass testing at a national level. And I think definitely what we're seeing in terms of the innovation just in the region is quite good, and we need to learn from one another. Madagascar, Sierra Leone being some of the key countries that are dealing with this, and also see South Africa in terms of the policy response in our phased approach of easing the lockdown is definitely one of the countries that the rest of the region can definitely learn from.